Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 11, Conflict Management Skills. And I know in many of the chapters that we've discussed already, I have been alluding to this conflict management skill chapter and how so many of the skills we're learning we will talk about in further detail in the conflict management section. So we have finally made it, we're here, and I think you will see a lot of the skills that we've learned and we've talked about are going to build up to this point. And so we will be able to reflect back on some of the things we've already learned in other capacities and then see how they can be applied to conflict management and resolution. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a disclaimer here, this is a very, very detailed chapter, a very long lecture. So if you need to take a break, feel free to pause me, come back and see me when you're ready. Okay, so conflict management is not a single skill, but it's a set of skills. And I think sometimes we think of it in terms of one issue. So we have conflict and it's a single thing we need to do to fix the conflict. And it really is quite an extensive collection of skills and tools and knowledge that all combine together to effectively manage conflict. Success in conflict management is based on acquiring knowledge about what it is, first of all, what makes it happen, meaning what creates the conflict, and what we can do about the conflict after the fact. So kind of a three-part thing there where we have to acquire knowledge about those three areas. And so our success in how well we handle conflict will be based on our knowledge of those three issues. So I'd like you to briefly consider, what is conflict? In your own words, how would you identify conflict? And you can either choose to write it down or just think about it, but I'd like you to spend just a few seconds really determining how you would explain to someone what conflict is. And of course it's going to be different for everybody, so my definition would be different than yours, and that's okay, because remember, interpersonal communication is contingent on our own experiences. So our experience with conflict is going to determine how we define it. So an official definition, if you will, is a struggle that occurs when people cannot agree on a way to meet their needs and achieve their goals. And we're back to this again. Our goal with interpersonal communication is to have our needs met and to have our goals achieved. So the easiest way to think about it is, if that is not taking place, then there's going to be a conflict. And often I think we think of conflict in terms of an argument or a misunderstanding or a disagreement, but if we boil everything down, the root of it truly lies in not having our needs met and our goals achieved, which is interesting to consider because often we blame others for conflict, but if we're identifying that our needs aren't being met and our goals aren't being achieved, then it's certainly contingent on our interpretation and perception as well. People in conflict, this is important to note, people in conflict are interdependent. And we've talked about interdependency a couple of weeks back, I think, but in conflict specifically, what one person does affects the other. And I think we talked about how conversation is reciprocal, and so same principle here, but when we're in conflict, what we do affects the other person and what the other person does affects us. So the interdependency means that we have no choice but to be connected even through the conflict. And the intensity of the conflict is related to the intensity of the unmet needs or goals. Remember when we talked about relationships, we talked about how that in power specifically, we talked about how when you have a lot of needs, the other person wields a lot of power over you. And so, interestingly, if you kind of flip that into conflict, the intensity of the conflict is related to the intensity of the unmet needs or goals. So how drastic you perceive the situation because your needs aren't being met, that will determine how major the conflict becomes, at least in your mind anyway. And then finally, conflict is based on differences in goals, needs, and experiences. And so we've kind of covered all of that in what was just said. So I'd like to briefly discuss some myths about conflicts, because I think often we don't appropriately identify and appropriately understand conflict. So one myth is that conflict is always a sign of a poor interpersonal relationship. I think often it is, but it is not always. And one of the things I think I've shared with you before not using absolutes. So you can already see that every single one of these has an absolute. So you already know they're all going to be missed because we talked about truth and lies, and absolutes will inevitably result in a lie. So conflict is not always a sign of a poor interpersonal relationship, and we will actually look at these individually and go into further detail. Conflict can always be avoided, also a myth. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Conflict always occurs because of misunderstandings. Again, not true. And in that instance, often we completely understand one another, but the conflict ensues. And so it does not always result from misunderstanding. Conflict can always be resolved. I think often we feel that we need to work toward resolution, but the reality is that sometimes with certain people in certain circumstances, conflict can't be resolved. And conflict is always bad. Also a myth. Conflict can be healthy and good and appropriate. Okay, so let's look at these individually. Conflict is always a sign of a poor interpersonal relationship. Free expression of honest disagreement is a sign of healthy relationship. And remember, we talked about a while back being completely open and honest with the other person and about their flaws and things like that. And I actually asked you to reflect on that. Well, very similar concept here. If you are open and honest and truthful with a person with whom you're in a relationship, that clearly indicates that you have a healthy relationship if you can be free to express disagreement or, dissatisfaction with something. And kind of piggybacking on the last thing, which we'll talk about in a minute, sometimes conflict is constructive. Sometimes it leads people to focus on issues that may need attention. And especially from a counseling perspective, you can't expect people to read your mind. And so learning how to be assertive and learning how to communicate what you're feeling and what you're thinking, that is a sign of self-development and self-awareness. And so if you can have someone approach you and say, this is something that I think really, I'd appreciate if you would focus on, that can be very constructive because, you don't always know that someone is frustrated or angry or upset if they're not willing to tell you. Okay, number 2, conflict can always be avoided. We are often taught that conflict is bad, but again, not true. And conflict does not need to be intense. I think because we have a perception most of the time that conflict is really devastating and it's really over the top and it's, really intense, that we have a negative perception of it. But the reality is that conflict can be very small and insignificant. Even differences of opinion can qualify as conflict. So, sometimes I don't like that color and you do. If we have a discussion about that, that can be considered conflict because differences of opinion is a conflict. But again, it doesn't have to be monumental and overwhelming. Okay, conflict always occurs because of misunderstandings. And this one I felt was easiest to give you a little vignette. So here's the example. Ron knows Janice wants to sleep, and Janice knows Ron wants to stay up and work. So the real conflict is that they disagree about whose goal is most important. It's not a misunderstanding. And that brings me to share a little personal story. My husband and I, when we were early on in our marriage, we came to this understanding that the way that we would resolve issues is we determine what is most important to that person. In other words, I'll give you like a real world example. We kind of agreed that it was Eric's responsibility to take the trash out to the street and the recycling bins. Well, what ended up happening is recycling day would come, garbage day would come, and they wouldn't get put out to the street. And I would get frustrated and say, that's your responsibility, you need to do it, etc., etc. And he would say, if it's that important to you, then you do it. And, that was kind of like, what? But what ended up happening is we were able to recognize that if we identify how important it is to us, that will determine the decision that is made. So we will actually say to each other sometimes, okay, this is more important to me than it is to you. And, with the garbage issue, we ended up resolving that he would take the garbage out, I would take the recycling out. But, there are times when we will actually indicate to each other this is more important to me. This is a bigger issue to me than it is to you. So therefore, that's the way this is going to go. And that's not to say that it's selfish. It's a compromise. And in that way, we're avoiding misunderstanding because we're clearly communicating, this is, extremely significant and important of an issue to me. And so let's look at whose goal is most important. And then that way we eliminate that misunderstanding component. Okay. Conflict can always be resolved. Not all differences can be resolved by listening harder. Sometimes, I would say often, often people will say, you just never listen to me, or, I just can't ever get them to listen to what I have to say, or they don't ever want to talk about anything. And again, notice those are all blaming statements and not I statements, so therein lies the first problem. But secondly, I think there's a perception that if you just would pay more attention, or if you would listen to me more, that this would be better. And the reality is, that's not usually the root of the problem. And even paraphrasing your partner's message, that's a skill that we learned, but not all differences can be resolved by doing something like that. Sometimes you may just have to agree to disagree. And it's just the way it goes. Okay, so let's look at types of conflict. Most conflicts fit into one of three categories, and we will go through each of these three individually. So pseudo conflict, simple conflict, and ego conflict. And I know you're probably not necessarily familiar with these, and so I'm going to make sure that they're clearly explained. Pseudo conflict, misunderstandings. Okay, so let's look at these. It occurs when we simply miss the meaning in a message. So in other words, someone's telling you all about what needs to happen at a meeting at work, and they're telling you what you need to bring, what you need to prepare for, and what you need to be ready to talk about, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point in there, they threw in that it started at 8, but you were focusing on all the other things, and so you missed that the meeting was supposed to start at 8. So then, you have that misunderstanding moment where you say, I need to clarify what time the meeting starts because I missed that. I know that it was said, but I missed it. And clarifying the message can avoid real conflict, because can you imagine if your boss expects you to be there, you don't show up at 8, you show up at 9, and then there's a huge conflict because your boss was relying on you and counting on you, etc. So clarifying the message can avoid the conflict even before it begins, which is always helpful. And it's easier when you establish supportive okay, I hope that's the last one. Supportive rather than defensive climate. We've talked a lot about what creates a defensive climate. So if you're thinking about conversations, especially in light of conflict, if we can establish supportive climates, that can be really, really helpful at avoiding conflict. And then the idea of tunnel vision, where you have that I'm right and I only see it my way. My dad enlightened me to this word when I was very, very little. My dad, he's one of those guys that he doesn't often have a lot to say, but when he does have something to say, it's usually worth listening to. Usually. And he was this guy who, he owns his own business, never went to college, but he has always been intrigued by words and loves doing crossword puzzles, etc. So for the longest time, he would open his dictionary to a random page, close his eyes and point at a word, look at it, and whatever that word was, he would read the definition and try to use it in a sentence that day. So I got the joy of having these random dictionary words, told to me as a child. So one of the words that he loved to use is myopic. And that's very similar to the tunnel vision concept. Myopic is one point of view, basically. Myopia is the root word of that. So if you're thinking about, I only see things my way, I only see things from my point of view, it can escalate the misunderstanding into a real conflict. Because remember, pseudo conflict is not quite a conflict yet. It's still at the misunderstanding level. So these are all ways that we can try to make sure that it doesn't escalate into full conflict, but tunnel vision is a very, very good way to make sure that it's going to go way far out of your control of misunderstanding. Because if we aren't willing to see the other person's perspective, if we're not willing to clarify, if we're not willing to have a supportive climate, then we're asking for it to escalate to conflict. So simple conflict is just a different stand on the issue.